All right, so now at the back end of book three, I want to retrace some of the points that we made going into the Republic text and try to show really what Socrates radically has been proposing so far and some of the subtleties and symbolisms that go along with that. So, Plato essentially is trying to become the new Homer, and he wants to redefine morality and reform education with the hero as the man who is most wise, as opposed to something like a warrior cult stance, or with the Homerics and the warrior like virtues that perpetuate in those texts. So Plato is trying to downgrade essentially the Homeric hero as no longer the ideal instantiation of what the Athenian elite should be, and he takes them down to the silver class, as it were, as opposed to the gold, which is reason, which is the wise. Knowledge then is going to be the guidance to this new education, as the Homeric hero for Socrates is insufficient and ultimately is a result of the very bad education that Socrates is against. Essentially, the warriors, or the former Homeric virtuous man, is a guardian, and not a very good one at that, is what Plato and Socrates would say. He should not act in the ideal of Achilles. And so this is going to require new poetry and values, and of course, as we went through in book three, the censorship of the poets. You should pick and choose the values out of those myths that actually go towards the education you're trying to bring about. And so this is a very pivotal point in the Republic, and a very controversial one with the censorship of the poets. So when Homer does good, we're going to teach Homer, but omit those bad, educated virtues and even vices, as it would turn out to be. Let's get rid of those and go for the good that Homer can do. And so, it's important to consider that, of course, the Republic is written in a time where the Athenians had built this great empire and ultimately lost it, and lost in the Peloponnesian War. And it was really seen at the time as really an extension of the pride and greed of the Athenian people. And so Plato is very focused on that aspect of trying to control your own soul, of trying to control desire for something like moderation, to have courage, and to act in accordance to reason. Because it's this kind of mentality prior, with pride and greed and overextending an empire, that led to its very demise. So Plato is going to focus on the soul and how we need to try to get that right. And so then we turn to the famous discussion of the myth of the metals, which is connected, of course, to the noble lie. And this is one of the great ironies, I would say, that you would find not just in the Republic, but with largely Platonic philosophy, is, of course, Plato and Socrates are for the truth and its goodness, but yet they advocate for this noble lie here. And so what makes a lie noble is something one might ask. Lie, and so the noble lie could be regarded as something along the lines of a disruption of resentment that could be formed between different classes, with this case the metals, and how they could resent each other and not form a harmonious city. And so the noble lie really is that Socrates says that we're all of the earth, and the god in some put gold to be, of course, the philosopher king, silver to be of the warrior, and everyone else is in the standing of bronze. And so each person has a piece of one of these metals within them. And of course, this also means that since everyone has some sort of metal, some sort of relationship with, God putting them into the world, then they should be respected as such, and not only respected, but should have reverence to, be satisfied with their position given to them, and then able to actually articulate, or the telos, which of course is important for Greek, through their lives, the type of soul that they have been given. And so, in this sense, of course, Plato's city is a very rigid hierarchy of a society where it is in a fixed position, which of course is going to lead Plato, and I think this is very important to understand in his critique of democracy, really, that not everyone has equal access to the truth. Since there is difference within the hierarchy of the metals here, then some are going to have more access to the gods, if you were, or truth, than other people. And so there is no equal knowledge here to truth or reason. So this is, of course, the opposite of what a modern liberal society would say, or to have a democratized education, as it were, and have a free and open society to equal opportunity to access to that truth. Plato believes in a small elite who make decisions, and of course this is in tandem with, as we mentioned, where the Republic was written historically at the time. Democracy made a lot of bad decisions during Plato's life. They literally will kill Socrates in the end. And of course they overextended their empire and made a lot of these bad decisions. And it was under this democratic rule at the time that Plato's critiquing here. So all poetry is to be censored and supervised by the guardians. And Plato saw the flaws of democracy. Essentially, Plato's elite are the decision makers of the society of what should and should not be censored in arts and poetry. And of course, this is going to play into how the guardians are going to be educated to be a sort of philosophical dog who understands its owner, loves its owner, and is loyal to it. This is the idea of the good education, and with that is an orderly soul. And if you have an orderly soul, then you're living an orderly life and inhabiting a city that is also orderly. So Plato, interesting enough, is going to advocate against the idea of wealth being rewarded to the philosopher kings, or the elite, really. And so this is a very radical idea where, the surplus, the private earnings, if you will, and property that goes with it is not to be distributed inequitably to the elites, but to actually the producers, the craftsmen. Put plainly, the wealth generated in this society is to be distributed the least to the actual elite. And everything else is to go to the craftsmen and workers. So the bronze people are actually going to get the highest return on their wealth and their labor. And of course, this is a regime that isn't economically bound, but one of political authority, where the elites are going to control matters of politics and decision making, but this isn't to coincide with the economic strata. And then we turn to Book 4, which Automontus, of course, is going to object to such a city, because this isn't going to create a happy elite. The elite should have wealth, they should have nice possessions and have property as such. And Socrates is going to say no to this, because it is the good of the whole city. And the ideal city is for the good of the entire body, of its entire immune system, if you will. And each element performs its task and its telos, if you will. And justice, each part of this civilization, just as each part of the soul and how it's reflective of that, is going to naturally do what it's supposed to do. The bronze soul, which is equated to desire, such as the desire for more money or sex and the pleasures that must be and all that is represented with it. Their virtue is to have moderation and to ultimately control their desires to make a more orderly soul. And this isn't to turn off desire, of course. We wouldn't be very human then if we just flip the switch on things like sex or wealth or status. But in acting in accordance to moderation, to be able to temperament those desires, even though they should be expressed, I would say. The silver, or the warrior class, as it were, is going to be really fashioned for Socrates around Sparta custom, because of course the Spartans would rout the Athenians, and so he's looking on to how this the Spartan class, the Spartan institutions and warrior class acted, and so he's going to invoke a lot of those customs as a callback, which of course is going to enrage a lot of the Athenians, as it turns out, to look at your enemy and be able to say, hey, I think that they're actually doing something better here, that we aren't sufficient enough, and as proven in the Peloponnesian War, and so maybe we should look at what these Spartans are doing. And so he's going to take something like common housing and a lot of the warrior aspects of Sparta and implement them with the Greeks in this new warrior class in the ideal city. And a lot of it revolves around that communal aspect of young men and the city. And then we turn to the gold and the relationship with that to the city and the soul. These few elites are going to have true knowledge and are going to really be trusted with the ordering and the rule of the city. And as a gold soul, this part of the soul in its analogy is going to be the heart of reason. And so you see here, Plato's made a tripartite of the soul and the city, and it's an analogy that is, of course, all throughout the Republic of how the soul and how it's compositioned will affect the composition of the community that it's inhabiting. And then we turn to really the most explicit evidence really we have of what the Platonic virtues really are supposed to be. And so the happy soul and the happy city is the composition of the wise, of the courageous, and the moderate. And you see that same schema really extend from how we do our politics, how education should be, our institutions, and then how we as people act with those virtues in mind, and how that's going to play out in political affairs. And so justice then is the harmony of those Platonic virtues and the orderness of those three parts of your soul. And now we get to one of the most beautiful points, I think, really within the Republic is, as the three of these individuals here are talking about justice, or are trying to figure out, what justice really means in a sort of abstract way, a sort of reasoned out way, you actually see each of these individuals here embody what justice actually is through this discourse. Because, as I mentioned earlier with, the three characters here really representing the three archetypes of the soul here, you have Automontus, who is the man of moderation. You have Glaucon, who is always courageous, and then you have Socrates, who is distributing wisdom. And so we see the symbols really act out within the people themselves and how they construct this very conversation of justice. And as it turns out, really, the combination of these three souls and their different temperaments trying to collaborate for justice in political manners is actually justice. And I think it's one of the most beautiful points of the book, really. At the end of book 4, we have seen that justice is to the soul as health is to the body. And then turning to the beginning of book 5, this is where Polemachus and Thrasymachus briefly make their return, and Adeimantus acts really out of character. He's the moderate here, but he actually stops Socrates, and this is a very courageous act. This is something that you would have expected Glaucon to do earlier in the book, and it's a sort of recreation here, but this time it's with Adeimantus, and so he stops Socrates and asks him to explain all these radical ideas he's now come up with the Sparta communal customs that he's trying to put in, or his views on women and the abolition of property. So we're seeing here that Adeimantus is actually being elevated in some degree, because he's tapping into different aspects of the soul that maybe he wasn't prerequisited with, but is able to be elevated by the wisdom that Socrates has brought about here. And so Socrates says, ironically, that he didn't want to get involved with this, but I think we can insinuate with how, he led these young men through this discussion, kind of fashioning even the way he spoke in the dialogue with Thrasymachus to bring them to a greater discussion. And of course, this is what he does. It's to have these very discussions. And so to say that he doesn't want to get involved with this is, I think, a very sort of funny irony here. So Socrates is going to say that this is a very difficult task for me, because, if you think the arguments that I had before were already radical, we're going to presuppose that, to look into these other ideas, that you must be able to at least entertain the ideas before them, insofar as, just to not to be totally dismissive like a lot of people would have been. So Socrates is going to take this on in different ways here. Socrates first is going to address women and what is to become known really as a prototype of what the feminist movement is going to have to find in its roots here. So Socrates says that women should also be educated the same as men, which of course is very radical for its time. Socrates believes, and of course his philosophy is one really of mind, of soul, of cultivation of the soul. And minds then can be taught proper and in a similar way with geometric proofs. They have access to the truth. They can find those answers themselves. And of course, geometry is going to be really the most maturation of truth in the world, as it turns out, for Plato and Socrates. Since they are able to have access to this logos, rather than their lived body of what was seen prior, body that you were given can limit the access to the logos, but when it comes to mind, there is much more access to logos if you were to take a proposition that the mind and the soul is more important than the body. And so Socrates proposes that, of course, they should be educated likewise. And if they're going to be educated likewise, then that means that they're going to have the same roles in society as men. And again, this shows how, with Socrates, since he cares more about the cultivation of soul, of mind, and the body is becoming secondary, which is a kind of a slight, really, towards how things were done before. And so that's where you really see where he's coming from, if you consider that with ideas like communism and really the abolishing of the family unit. And so if we're to have the best society, then we must create the best men, and with that they must also be with superior women. And so you have a sort of eugenic proposition here, where each generation that's going to come out of when elites keep reproducing themselves, will create better and stronger generations. And so essentially, the ones who behave well, who act orderly with the unity of the soul, and is going to put that output into their greater community, are to be reproduced. They are of the good, and we must be able to sustain it and create an even better good. And this gets kind of confusing because, of course, Socrates, he talks about abolishing the family unit, but in some regard, we have to consider that what he's really saying is that, the family ties within the community will be so strong that it'll essentially be one giant family. And so you won't necessarily just have, just one family unit that you could, really trust, and you sort of atomize yourself. This is extended to all of your community. Everyone around you is kind of an extension of your family because it's your people. And this is important for the elites in society to see that sort of harmony in relationship with their city, because all of the gold and the silver lined should see the city as their own. And with that, that's going to unify really the public and the private good. And now, while that might not be a sufficient answer for you with regards to the problem of what is public and what is private, what is earned onto you, and then what should be sort of distributed out amongst others, and what are the labels to be in particular, and the lines to be drawn really of what that really means and how it should be done. If you disagree with Plato, which there's plenty to object to perhaps here, we do see this conversation ultimately has been going on for thousands of years, however, between this distinction really of what is the public good and what is the private good. Just because that he might not have had a sufficient answer. Again, this goes back to that idea I have on the channel of philosophy might not be the best when it comes to particular answers, but it is the questioning, the critical analysis in its time that really I think is the fruits of what philosophy has to offer. And then turning to his third argument, which is revolving around the practicality of the philosopher king himself. Glaucon says that he's advanced beyond the mistakes that he had made earlier in the book, and he's bought in to some degree of of what Plato's proposing here. It at least sounds good on paper, if it were. But can we really have this city? And can we really create not just an elite class, but a special subset of people who are going to act well and be able to make qualified decisions? And really this questioning here is to point out, again, back to the pre-Socratics and their predecessors, really that relationship with physis, and which of course is nature. And it seems like nature, or physis, acts against this will that Plato has for the world that he wants to live in. And the king seems to embody that, and in its practice and access to knowledge about the way physis actually is going, or acquired knowledge about physis. Ultimately, we find this tension, though, between theory and practice. If theory can be brought to practice, and we have this disjunction that, of course, Plato concedes, otherwise I don't really think the Republic would have been written as such. This tension between theory and practice means that ultimately Plato is going to propose that there's something actually illusory about this world, that there's something that's not quite right, where we can't have a practical philosopher king embodied. And that's going to lead us into his discussion really of epistemology and those manners. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and continue to watch the series. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one.